They ate each other. They went mad from thirst. They threw women overboard. Under the scorching sun, knee-deep in water. How did 147 people become 15? This is not a story about a shipwreck. This is a story of how civilization crumbles in 13 days. On July 2nd, 1816, the French frigate Medusa ran aground 40 kilometers off the African coast. Captain de Chaumareys, an elderly and inexperienced sailor, panicked. Along with the governor and the elite, he hastily occupied the lifeboats. For the remaining 147 people, a raft was hastily constructed from logs and planks. The raft had no steering or navigation. The plan seemed logical. The lifeboats were supposed to tow the raft to shore, but within hours it became clear this was impossible. Overloaded with people and weighing several tons, the raft was too heavy. Fearing that the desperate people on the raft would try to climb into the boats, those in the lifeboats cut the ropes. The raft was left adrift in the open ocean, abandoned to its fate. The raft was a mix of people from different social groups: soldiers, sailors, colonists, craftsmen, and a few officers. Conflicts arose almost immediately. The officers tried to impose order, but their authority quickly crumbled. The soldiers and sailors who made up the majority refused to obey. Attempts to establish discipline failed. On the very first night, fights broke out over food and safe spots. The officers, armed with swords, tried to maintain control, but their efforts were futile against the mob. By morning, 20 people were dead, either killed or having thrown themselves overboard. People stood knee-deep in icy water, clinging to the mast. Waves washed the weak overboard. Legs were broken, caught in the gaps between the logs. Supplies were scarce: a barrel of wine and a handful of biscuits. The center of the raft, the only dry spot, became a battleground. By morning, another 20 bodies were thrown into the sea. By the fourth day, only 67 of the original 147 remained. Hunger turned people into animals. They ate leather belts and the corpses of the dead. By the eighth day, the 15 strongest threw the wounded and sick overboard. "We even threw away our weapons to avoid killing each other," one survivor later recounted. Meanwhile, Captain de Chaumareys and the governor in the lifeboats safely reached the shore. Instead of organizing a rescue for the survivors, they sent the ship Argus to the wreck site to retrieve valuables from the stranded Medusa. Aboard the frigate were 17 people who had refused to board the raft. By the time the Argus reached the Medusa, only 2 of them were still alive. After collecting the valuables, the ship set sail back. On its way, it accidentally stumbled upon the raft. By then, 13 days had passed since the raft had been set adrift. Of the 147 people who had boarded it, only 15 remained alive. They were living skeletons, emaciated, covered in wounds and burns from the salt water. Among them were the doctor Henri Savigny and the engineer Alexandre Courier, who later described the horror in their book. The book? The wreck of the frigate Medusa became a sensation, but the French authorities tried to cover up the scandal. Captain de Chaumareys was convicted, but given only a suspended sentence. The story of the Medusa became a disgrace for France. The artist Théodore Géricault, like a detective, reconstructed the tragedy. He spoke with survivors, sketched corpses in morgues, and built a replica of the raft. His painting depicts the moment when the survivors spotted the Argus and desperately waved to it. The ship passed by twice before accidentally noticing them on its return journey. Géricault captured the horror in the foreground, the bodies of the dead in the center, desperate people, and in the background, a black sailor waving a cloth. When the painting was exhibited in 1819, it caused a scandal. Viewers were outraged, and authorities called it filth, but Géricault forced France to face its shame. The raft of the Medusa became not only a masterpiece, but also an indictment of the system that allowed the disaster to happen. Conscience is the only raft that does not sink, but are you ready to stay afloat on it? Captain de Chaumareys changed his name after the scandal and died in obscurity. Géricault hid the governor's face in the painting, among the pile of the dead,